Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the November edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. My name is Chris Furman. I'm the regional climatologist with NOAA's Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a climate overview of the past several weeks. Our other speakers today are Todd Hamill from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources update, Pam Knox from the University of Georgia, who will provide an agricultural impacts update. And joining us today, we have Michelle LaRue from NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, who will be giving us an update on the El Niño-Southern Oscillation and discussing the upcoming winter and spring outlooks for the Southeast. So again, thank you all for joining us. Just a reminder to type your questions and comments into the question box at any time, and they'll be answered at the end. Also, a recap email of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to this recording. All right, so let's get started with an overview of the climate. So over the past 3 weeks since our last webinar, we've seen unseasonably warm weather across nearly all the region. These maps are from the Climate Perspectives tool that we discussed last time. The map on the left shows the mean temperature anomalies for the 3-week period beginning October 22nd and ending November 11th. And what we see are mean temperatures running about 2 to 4 degrees above average across the southern part of Florida. Then as we move north, we see temperatures running 5 to 6 degrees above average in places. And then as we get into the Carolinas and Virginia, we see several locations running 7 to 8 degrees above average, even a few places running around 10 degrees above average over this 3-week period. So how unusual are these temperatures? Well, the map on the right shows how these temperatures rank over the period of record of each station. And all the locations highlighted in red, that's about a third of all the stations shown, are those that ranked in the top 5 warmest for this particular 3-week period. And those locations you see there in maroon, including places like Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, and Lynchburg, Virginia, they recorded their warmest or tied for their warmest average temperature during this 3-week period. And although we don't show it here, I'll say that mean temperatures across Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands were near normal over the last several weeks. Okay, next slide. Now, much of this warmth has actually occurred over the past 2 weeks since we turned the calendar from October to November. So here we're looking at the ranks for average temperatures over the first 2 weeks of November, and now we see a whole lot of red, and we also see a whole lot of maroon as well. In fact, nearly 3/4 of the stations shown here recorded one of their top 5 warmest starts to the month of November, and almost a third of these stations recorded their warmest or tied for their warmest start to the month. Okay, next slide. So in terms of precipitation, much of the Southeast continues to be dry, but you'll notice that there's a swath of above average precipitation extending from Florida up through Georgia and western portions of the Carolinas and Virginia. And this precipitation was largely connected with Hurricane Nicole, which we'll talk about more on the next slide. The heaviest rainfall from Nicole, at least in the mainland Southeast, was recorded along the I-4 corridor from Tampa to Daytona Beach, where some gauges recorded up to 8 inches of rain. And I say the mainland Southeast because the subtropical low that would eventually become Hurricane Nicole dropped over 10 inches of rain across parts of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And we can see that in the anomaly map there on the right-hand side. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the big story over the past several weeks has been Hurricane Nicole. You can see the track of Nicole there on the left. That image is courtesy of the North Carolina State Climate Office. Hurricane Nicole formed from a subtropical low near the Greater Antilles back on November 5th and became a subtropical cyclone on November the 7th. The next day, Nicole became a tropical storm and made its first landfall on Great Abaco Island in the Bahamas, then quickly strengthened to a Category 1 hurricane before making its second landfall on Grand Bahama. On November the 10th, Hurricane Nicole made landfall near Vero Beach, Florida, with maximum sustained winds of 75 miles an hour. It then weakened back into a tropical storm as it crossed Florida, affecting many of the same areas that were impacted by Hurricane Ian. Then later in the day, it entered the Gulf of Mexico, made a second landfall in Florida near Cedar Key, then rode up the Big Bend region of Florida before moving inland, eventually weakening to a tropical depression as it moved northward across western Georgia. By the next day, November 11th, Nicole was a tropical low centered over the southern Appalachians and then transitioned to a post-tropical cyclone over West Virginia before moving towards the northeast U.S. Over the weekend. Nicole was the third hurricane on record since 1851 to make landfall in Florida in the month of November. The last one was Hurricane Kate back in 1985. Nicole was also the first hurricane to make landfall on Florida's east coast since Katrina back in 2005. The biggest impacts from Nicole, as I'm sure you all saw, were the storm surge and high surf, which resulted in significant coastal erosion, particularly in the communities of Daytona Beach, Wilbur by the Sea, St. Augustine, and Flagler Beach. Unfortunately, these locations were also impacted by Hurricane Ian nearly 2 months ago. And so these areas were particularly vulnerable to additional surge, up to 5 feet and higher in some places. And also high winds. And so we had all these with Nicole. In fact, these areas were hit with at least tropical storm force winds, maybe 50, 60 miles an hour, and high surf as well for multiple days. And so when you combine that with the structural weaknesses and damage from Ian, Nicole resulted in significant property damage along the coast and even damage to roadways and seawalls and other infrastructure. In addition, over 300,000 customers in Florida lost power during the storm. Tropical storm and surge warnings were also issued for parts of coastal Georgia and South Carolina, but the impacts there were relatively minimal. After moving inland, the circulation associated with Nicole spawned some tornado warnings in parts of North Carolina and Virginia, but as far as I've been able to find, nothing's been confirmed, though there were a few scattered high wind reports in Virginia. And as of yesterday, this may have changed, but as of yesterday, there were 5 confirmed deaths in Florida related to Nicole, and the current damage estimates are in excess of $500 million. That would make it the 3rd costliest hurricane of this hurricane season. Okay, next slide. All right, so we still have a few weeks left in the hurricane season, but if we don't see any further activity, then we'll end the season with 14 named storms, 6 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes. Major hurricanes are those that are Category 3 and higher. 6 of these storms, including both of the major hurricanes, impacted the southeast region, including Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Based on the most recent 30 years of data, the 14 named storms would be just about right at the 30-year average. The 6 hurricanes would be just below the average of 7, and the 2 major hurricanes would be just below the average of 3. The accumulated cyclone energy produced over the season is running about 80% of normal, which according to the CPC puts the season in the near normal category. Okay, next slide. Okay, turning our attention to the U.S. Drought Monitor, we can see that drought continues to plague the majority of the country. In fact, over the past 5 weeks, as you can see there on the right, we've seen the highest percentage of the country under at least abnormally dry conditions in the 22-year history of the U.S. Drought Monitor that spans an incredible 1,200 weeks. Okay, next slide. Zooming in on the southeast, we can see that drought has expanded and intensified since the last webinar. At that time, about 43% of the region was at least abnormally dry. That number has now gone up to 67%. The areas that have seen the biggest expansion of D0 include central and eastern portions of North Carolina and Virginia. About 30% of the region is now experiencing at least moderate drought, with the biggest increases seen across the state of Alabama. We've also seen an increase in severe drought, D2 drought, particularly across the Florida Panhandle, as well as central and northern Georgia, also extreme northwest South Carolina and southwestern North Carolina. It looks like the rain from Nicole may result in some small improvements this week in places, but overall it looks like that rain will at least temporarily halt any further degradation. And although not shown here, heavy rains over the past couple of months have eliminated drought in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Okay, next slide. And consistent with the long range and seasonal projections that we've looked at over the past few months, drought is expected to persist with additional development across the southeast region. In fact, the southeast is one of the regions with the highest confidence in the seasonal drought outlook. Some good news for Puerto Rico, they're likely to remain drought free through the end of January. And I'll say that the next seasonal outlook will actually be released later this week, so we're a couple days early. So check back the link there at the bottom of the slide, and we'll see if there's any updates to the forecast. Okay, next slide. So looking ahead to next week, below average temperatures are likely across much of the region, except across extreme southern Florida, while precipitation is leaning above average, except across portions of North Carolina and Virginia. Next slide. And that pattern is also reflected in the 2-week forecast. So looking like a cooler and maybe wetter Thanksgiving holiday week, and that's certainly positive news for the drought. Okay, next slide. However, if we look out 3-4 weeks, it's looking like we may round out the month and begin December on the warm and dry side, again, which aligns with most of the seasonal forecasts that we're going to hear about later. Okay, next slide. Okay, and here's a summary for you to look over after the webinar. I'm happy to answer questions at the end, and with that, I'll turn it over to Todd.
Okay, well, I'll get started here. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. And so we're going to look at how all of that affects the southeast rivers. And we're going to look at a broad overview here. And you can see this is the USGS data and for the rivers. And on the left-hand side shows a big mix of above normal, near normal, and below normal all across the southeast. Very interesting. But overall, as you can look on the right-hand side, as we get into November, our stream flows are dropping to near below normal. We have stayed in the normal range. And again, we're looking at the whole southeast now. So areas in Florida do impact that. And that's maybe part of the reason that we have stayed out of the below normal category, because you saw before that we have a lot of areas in drought across much of the southeast, but that does not include Florida right now. So let's look at specifically at each state and talk a little bit more about that. And so we'll go to the next slide and go to each state. And the first one we'll talk about is Alabama on the left. And as with the drought monitor, we've been dry as far as the rainfall goes, and it has affected the rivers. And it's amazing how quickly we went from the September timeframe, where we were very wet, almost certainly above normal. But because we've been warm and dry, that area has had dropped to the below normal timeframe. And however, one thing you'll look at, this is the time of year when we expect it to be below the driest this time of year. As you look at the seasonal stream flows, this is the time when we expect it to be a little bit drier than we would. However, it's been drier than even in that can be. But we are starting to come out of that as we look ahead to our recharge/flood season coming up in the December to March timeframe. So we'll be looking for that. So then we get to Georgia, and you can see that much of Georgia, the similar thing happened. We had gotten some rains in September that had brought us up to in the normal range and almost to slightly above normal. And very quickly, with the above normal temperatures and below normal rainfall, we've gone into the well below normal area, almost in the record territory for Georgia for this time of year. So again, something we have to look at. And then there's Florida, which obviously during the September rainfalls and even in October and then on into November has had a huge impact on the rivers in Florida. Again, one of the things you'll notice here is that this is the wet season. We are nearing the end of the wet season, and when we would expect them to be warmer. So we should be starting the dry season as we move forward. So for those that are in flood, it should help the impacts and help them recover from a lot of that rainfall. We'll talk about Florida in just a minute, just as we get to the full map here in a minute. But let's go ahead and go to the next one, which we'll talk about South Carolina. So we'll move a little further north and get into South Carolina, and again, below normal. Now, the difference between the Alabama and Georgia area that we just talked about and what we saw in South Carolina, kind of North Carolina, is that for much of the late summer and through the fall, we have been flirting with below normal in a lot of those areas. Fortunately, we've had just enough rainfall to keep us from getting into the well below normal. But I've mentioned this before, but tropical rain is a part of the climatology of the region. And so while we don't want to get hurricanes, we don't want to get tropical storms, it is part of the climatology, and we do need that rain during that time of year. And we did get a little bit of it, which just kept us from being well below normal during that time. And so we continue to skirt that. But again, for this time of year, we're starting to come out of that, our dry time of year, and getting into the recharge season. North Carolina shows the very same thing. We flirted with the dryness all through the late part of the summer, most of the summer, and through this fall, and hopefully we will start to see a recovery, except for the fact that we're looking at maybe a dry coming up, but we'll hear more about that in a little while. And last is Virginia. Now, Virginia was a little further north and ended up not, and this doesn't cover just our area, it does cover places outside the Southeast River Forecast Center area. The Mid-Atlantic RFC covers part of this, but we did see more normal rainfall through much of the state, but dryness recently, but a little bit of wetness from the most recent storm in Nicole that has helped things. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So this is, it's previous to this time frame, you know, in the last couple of months, it seemed like there was always something in flood in the Southeast. And that's true for today, but one of the areas that was hit hardest, both in Ian and Nicole, has been the St. Johns River Basin. We expected when Ian hit that we would be in flood through sometime late in the November timeframe and maybe into early December. Well, now that Nicole has come through and dropped another anywhere between 5 to 8 inches of rain over those same basins, it's looking like sometime December, late December, before many of those areas come out of flood. And remember, all those, this is different than most of the rivers that we have in the Southeast, in that this one flows north, and the mouth of it is in Jacksonville. So it's a little bit different. It's all very flat, and it just takes a long time for water to move through those systems. So it will take a long time for that area to recover. But hopefully, as we move through into the dry season for Florida, that we will see improvements going forward. Otherwise, most of the Southeast, you saw that they're mostly either near normal or below normal. And even the most recent rainfall from last week and from the last couple of days from Nicole didn't have much of an impact at all on the Southeast. We had a few reservoirs go up, we had a few things happen, but overall, the rivers were in good shape. And part of that's been because we were dry. And the last thing I'll say about the Florida stuff, fortunately or unfortunately, we had been dry between Ian and Nicole. And so even though we did get heavy rains there, it did help keep things from other stuff from going into flood in Florida. And it probably helped the St. Johns Basin just at least a little bit. So let's go ahead and move forward to the next slide. So as I mentioned before, and we only have the Southeast climatology. We don't have the Florida climatology in this. But as we talk about the drought in the Southeast, we can see that we're at week 46 and we are starting to ramp back up. We show that weeks 35 through 41 indicate kind of hurricane season in the Southeast. And then we kind of have a lull usually during that November timeframe. I mean, it's usually that late October and early November timeframe. We don't have as much flooding, we don't have as many issues, and then we start to ramp back up. And as we get wrapped back around to the beginning of the year, this is our recharge time. So this is the time of year when we really hope to improve conditions across the Southeast that we have a drought in. And as we look at the seasonal forecast here in a few minutes, that will tell us a lot about how much we'll recover and where we'll be. But right now we're in week 46 and we're in that ramp up to the recharge season and / flood season. So let's go to the last slide, I believe. Oh, yes, it's the last slide. And so we show below normal risk of flooding. And part of the reason we show below normals are our rivers are below normal in this area. We aren't expecting above normal rainfall, at least for the time being, where things are not looking good for the Southeast. But for the near normal risk for flooding in Florida is only because they have been wet, and this is their dry season, so it doesn't take that much to keep them near normal for this time of year. So that's the reason we show a lot of that. So we'll go ahead and go to the last slide real quick, and it's just my overview slide. So if anybody has any questions afterwards, just let me know. And now we'll move on to Pam.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. It's raining here in Athens and about 40 degrees, and I am glad I'm not working outside. Let's jump right in. soil moisture, this was before the rain. So you can see the eastern half of the United States has been quite warm because of all the warm temperatures that Chris talked about. And it's also been fairly dry. Again, this does not reflect the current situation since I put the slides together yesterday morning. So this is the deeper soil moisture did not really get a lot of impact from Tropical Storm Nicole, which was more confined to the top part because it's been so dry, it just never got down to that level. If we go to the next slide, just a reminder, condition monitoring reports are always helpful for the drought monitor authors. And this is the number that we've gotten in the last 30 days. You can see there's a lot there in the part of Georgia that has had the worst drought. Some of us are convinced that it probably could be a D3 drought, but we were not successful in communicating that to the drought authors. They have their own set of priorities that they look at. But continue to send those reports in and they will be taken into account. If we go on, yesterday morning we did have a frost over a lot of the region. Again, I didn't catch that because I was doing the slides yesterday. Prior to that, we really hadn't had a frost since October, the last time we had one of these webinars. That was quite early. That was earlier than 1 in 10 years. Right now, the frost that we're getting is right about at the 50% line for a lot of the central part of Alabama and Georgia and South Carolina, even going on into North Carolina. The map on the right there is from agroclimate.org. You can find that out for yourself. But we did have frost again, really over most of the northern part of Georgia and the same areas in Alabama and the Carolinas. And so it looks like we probably won't see any more frost now that it's wet and the clouds are really keeping the temperatures up. Some areas will probably see it again by the end of this week, but most of the crops now are right near finish. There are some strawberries that have been planted and some winter vegetables that are out there, but everything else is really ramping down. If we go on, chill hours is something that the fruit producers are really looking at, and we started out ahead of normal. You can see the red line there is this year. We started out with that cold spell in October, bringing us some early chill hours, but we haven't had much since then. I expect to see that ramp up a lot in the next week or so as we go through this period of cooler temperatures. And so we'll be kind of riding the top edge of that blue curve, which is the area of all the possible accumulations depending on which year you looked at. This is the sort of the envelope of all the La Nina years we've had in the Southeast. And certainly a lot more than last year, which is in the green line there. And so that'll be interesting to see what happens when we get to spring. If we go through a period of warming after most of the fruit producing plants have gotten their necessary chill hours over the winter, they will be ready to go and bloom early. And that, of course, will make them more susceptible to a frost in the spring. There's a lot of time period that has to go through before that happens, but it's just something to keep in mind. If we go on, some of the impacts of recent conditions on agriculture, the frost damage from the October frost was found to damage a lot of unopened cotton bolls in parts of Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas. So some of those, if they're frost damaged, they're not going to open, and that will be a loss of yield for them. The rain from Nicole did help alleviate dry soil. Chris showed the map of where the rain fell. We're getting so late in the year, it may be too late to really do a lot of planting of small grains and pastures, but I'm sure folks are still out there now trying to take advantage of the wetter conditions as much as they can. There was not a lot of wind damage from Nicole seen on vegetables and other crops. The two pictures I have there on the left-hand side show some wind damage in a cotton field in Fort Valley, Georgia that happened. They also had frost damage from the October frost. And you can kind of see a lot of the bolls are blown off the plants. It makes it a lot harder to get a good clean harvest. And so there'll be some yield loss from that as well. Other than that, I have not really seen a lot from Florida. I think they're really so concerned with the damage from Hurricane Ian that, you know, at least from an agricultural perspective, they haven't seen a lot of additional harm. Now, maybe that it's just too early for us to see that yet. Warm and dry conditions at the beginning of November did help harvest wrap up early. My guess is that probably the impending arrival of Nicole may have helped that along. I know a lot of people were out harvesting overnight to try to get the cotton in before the wind got out and the rain got to parts of southwest Georgia and other places. So that may be a contributing factor to the fact that cotton harvest is ahead of normal this year, just because everybody was trying to get it in before the wind blew it away. And then the warm and dry conditions did also help harvest to wrap up early for peanuts and pecans and cotton as well. And the warmer conditions also did help strawberry planting. A lot of that was happening in the Carolinas. Was kind of held back by the cooler temperatures in late October, but that has really picked up quite a bit since then. And the peanuts really helped to mature more quickly so they could harvest them as well. If we go on, the climatology across the region in the next few weeks. Frost did cover significant parts of Georgia and other states early this week. Next chance is probably this weekend. That's for some of the areas that might have just gotten missed by the frost the last time or two. But you know, we're going to winter, and so the frost is going to extend farther out over time. The driest areas in the next few weeks are expected to be along the coastal plains away from the coast, but rain is really expected in all areas. And so that will help with soil moistures quite a bit. As Chris mentioned, I don't think we're going to see any likely decay or worsening of the drought, at least in the next week or two. And then, you know, we're near the end of the tropical season. That's a source of rain for us across the southeast. Not impossible that we might see another storm, but it's not too likely. We're going into the end of the season. And so that is something that's not going to be a major concern for agriculture. If we go on, here's my summary. I'm not going to spend time on it. You can see it in the notes or in the recording. So we'll leave it at that. If you've got questions, of course, you can type them into the chat. And now it's my honor to introduce Michelle Leroux, who's going to talk about ENSO and the outlook for 2022-2023. So take it away, Michelle.
All right. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it. These are some great talks. So we're going to kind of zoom out and look at the large scale climate variability picture. I'm the lead at the ENSO team at CPC. I will also be going into the outlooks. Why don't we go ahead and go to the next slide. So we have this ENSO alert system, and you can either be in an advisory, which means that conditions are present and expected to continue. You can be in a watch, means conditions are favorable for potentially development of El Nino or La Niña, or you could be not active. Next. So right now we are in a La Niña advisory. We've been there for a while. And this is the update as of last Thursday. And that update reads that there is a 76% chance of La Niña during the upcoming winter. And for winter for us is December through February. And then there is a basically a 57% chance of a transition to neutral starting around the February, March, April period. Next slide. So this is the typical circulation over tropical Pacific. I'm not going to get in a lot of detail here, but La Niña, what it does, it tends to amplify the circulation. Go ahead and click. And so essentially the circulation looks very similar to that image in the top left, which is showing the typical or neutral climatology over tropical Pacific. And bottom right there is La Niña. You can kind of think of it as a juiced up circulation. So you tend to have more rainfall convection over Indonesia, and you have more sinking over the Eastern Pacific. This is an acceleration of the Pacific Walker circulation. And then you see an acceleration of low-level trade winds as a result, and the water gets basically pulled away from South America and it upwells, so you see a further reinforced cooling of the subsurface. So those are all indicators that we're looking for when we decide whether a La Niña is present. Next slide. And so one of the biggest indicators that people look at is sea surface temperature departures or anomalies. And so the blues here mean that you have below average sea surface temperatures, and the reds mean that you have above average sea surface temperature. And right now, this is for the October 2022 average. We see that below average sea surface temperatures extending all the way from South America, really almost across the entire tropical Pacific. So this is a major player, and it's essentially a little accentuated, especially given how warm the surrounding oceans are right now. So it's very clearly a La Nina going on in the equatorial Pacific. And usually, and there's many, many different ways to measure ENSO, because as you can see, it's this circulation is above the ocean and also the ocean itself. But one of the more popular ways to measure ENSO is, go ahead and click, is this Niño 3.4 index region. So we just basically take sea surface temperatures within this box and we average them, and we remove a seasonal cycle, and that is called the Niño 3.4 index. So when you see negative values, that's more indicative of La Nina, and positive values is more indicative of El Nino. And this region is one of the reasons it was identified is because it is strongly related and correlated with the overturning circulation, and essentially the coupled processes that represent the ENSO pattern. All right, next slide. So this is really kind of taken off. This is probably a little bit the fault of the ENSO blog, but we've been looking at this for a while. We had what we called a double dip winter, meaning that we had a return of La Nina last winter. So this is now extending into the third winter, and as such, we have a variety of ways to refer to it: triple dip, triple decker, three-peat. All of this is just kind of fun terms to refer to the third winter of La Nina. And it was really quite interesting because over the past year, the Niño 3.4 value stayed quite cool, even through the spring and summer. So we've been in La Nina conditions extending well back into last winter. It was only, in the summer of 2021 that we actually saw a brief return to neutral, but this would be the third reoccurrence of La Nina. And I should mention the black line there is the current event, and this is a Niño 3.4 index. So again, when values are below that dashed line, is generally considered La Nina. And you'll note there's a lot of different colors here, and the colors were put there because we were in the second dip winter, and we were curious whether it went into an El Nino the third winter, La Nina the third winter, or neutral the third winter. And it sure does look like, and we're fully expecting this La Nina to go into the third winter. So eventually that black line will turn into a blue line, a darker blue line. Go ahead and click. A lot of people are asking us what these, sorry, go back. Yeah, so a lot of people are asking us what these other two blue lines were. So the last time we saw a third winter was 2000 and 2001, and then the other one was 1975-76. That's a very, very small sample, and some people have asked us whether we can look at those last two as an indicator for what might happen this coming winter, and I highly recommend not doing that. There's no indication that there's some special attribute in the climate system that would be associated with a third winter of La Nina. The bottom line is there's forcing from the tropical Pacific, it's La Nina, and so we should look at the broad category of historical La Nina episodes in order to figure out what might be happening this coming winter. All right, next slide. So this is a nice little graphic. By the way, I have links at the bottom in all these slides. A lot of these are ENSO blog articles, and this is the most recent one that we released last week. And we have this graphic in there. And one of the nice things about the ENSO blog is because it's government funded, and you can use any of these graphics for your presentations or or discussions, so they're free to use. Anyway, this is showing the subsurface of the tropical Pacific right now. So we're looking below the surface of the ocean down to about 300 meters below. And one indicator of this La Nina is these below average temperatures in the eastern part of the basin. Often you also see above average temperatures at depth in the western part of the basins, but we have to keep an eye on those. Those can shift eastward if conditions change near the surface. Right now, we don't see any indication that's happening, but the pattern looks very locked in. There's not a whole lot of movement here. So we do, this is sort of an indicator to us that La Nina should persist coming up here, at least for the next couple months. All right, next slide. This is looking at the cloudiness or rainfall anomalies, and the browns there indicate suppressed rainfall or less convection, and the greens are enhanced convection or rainfall. And this is a very, very classic La Nina appearance with wetter conditions over Indonesia and the maritime continent, and drier conditions in the western and central Pacific. So this is very conventional for La Nina. Go next slide. This is the outlook. This is the probabilities. Because there is a lot of uncertainty in seasonal forecasts, we try to express our outlooks in terms of percent chance. The blue there is percent chance of La Nina. The gray is percent chance of neutral, and the red is percent chance of El Nino. And we use those thresholds in the Niño 3.4 index. We use a data set called ERSST version 5. And that's how we verify these probabilities. So again, this was released last week, and we are pretty confident in the coming seasons that we're going to see a continuation of La Nina conditions, but those chances start decreasing as you get into the spring. By February, March, April, we actually favor neutral conditions, and those neutral probabilities increase as we get into this later spring and into the summer. Next slide. This is a newer tool. I don't love how it looks. There's definitely better ways we could show this off, but a lot of people do ask us how strong the event will be. And this is one way we measure that. Again, we're using the sea surface temperatures in a Niño 3.4 index, okay? So this is not an indicator of impacts over the southeast or in any part of North America. Generally, the strength of ENSO, the importance of this is not in the intensity of the impacts, but rather in the confidence of the impact. So the stronger the event, generally the more the probabilities for the impact can increase. But again, there's still probabilities. That means there's a percent chance that the expected impact won't happen either. So for this upcoming season, there's about a 45 to 60% chance that it will be less or at and less than -1. We're actually at most recent 3-month value came in for August, September, October, and that was at -1. So we already are in a moderate event, and we're sort of favoring that, at least in the near term. The Niño 3.4 values right now in the tropical Pacific are probably near their minimum. We're probably in the next couple months going to actually start seeing those values weaken. Just because the Niño 3.4 values are weakening, again, doesn't mean the impacts are going to weaken. In fact, we usually see impacts at lag because essentially you can think of ENSO as shoving around the tropical circulation, and then there's a ripple effect upon the Pacific North America region. That ripple effect does take some time to lock in and manifest itself. So this isn't like an on-off switch where a real quick change in the SSTs will flip the pattern quickly. Usually these things evolve slower, and there is some lag. Next slide. Okay, we'll go now to impacts. So this is a schematic. It's a really nice summary of the typical La Nina impacts. The problem is, of course, is that not all La Nina events look like the schematic. But in general, La Nina shifts the Pacific jet stream to the north. You get more ridging and blocking over the North Pacific Ocean. As such, downstream of that, you actually get a little bit in the way of troughing, particularly over like Western Canada and the northwestern CONUS. And then over the southeast, because the shift, the jet streams actually shifted climatologically a little bit more to the north and northwest. In the southeastern states, it tends to favor a warmer and drier winter. Next slide. The reality looks a lot more like this. And I apologize, these maps are a little dated. They're from last year. We don't have the most, last year was a La Nina, and it is not on this map because we haven't updated them, but they should be updated next week with our ENSO blog release. But one thing I really like, so this is showing all precipitation anomalies. Green means above average precipitation, brown's below average precipitation. And you can really see the variance from different La Nina winters. And I always try to stress this. Again, this is probabilities, which means the odds favor drying in the southeast, but there are certainly some exceptions to that. You can see the winter in the top left corner in 1973-74 was a La Nina and quite wet across many of those southeastern states. But by and large, if you look at each of these La Ninas, it does tilt toward dry. You see more in the way of browns, and that occurs maybe about 60 to 70% of the time. So odds are that we will see drier conditions from this La Nina. Next slide. This is temperature. Temperature is a little messier. The relationships are not as strong between ENSO and temperature as they are between ENSO and precipitation. So probabilities tend to drop here even further. There is definitely a tilt toward warmer conditions, there's reds in the southeast, but again, there are certainly some exceptions to this. And I like showing this because again, a lot of people are stressing those last, they're saying, well, if this is a third winter of La Nina, can we look at the other two third winters of La Nina to see what might happen? And I always point out, well, here in the top right is 1975, 76. So that was our third winter. And you can see that it was, you know, more normal or neutral, a little warmth, some cooling. And then in the bottom row there, you can see 2000, 2001, where it was quite different. And there was these blues over the southeast. So pattern was very different between those two triple dip La Ninas. So I would not look to subsetting the data this much in order to figure out what's going to happen. Go next slide. All right, so this is the map. If you've been on these calls the last two winters, this will look very familiar to you. This is for the December, January, February timeframe, and it's broadly similar. If you look at the map for January, February, March, and February, March, April, again, we do these in seasons or 3 months increments. It will look largely like this. And that is in the southeast, we are favoring above average temperatures and then also below median precipitation. Next slide. This is March through May. This is actually the first season where you see that tilt toward below average go away. So this is, it shows instead for the southeast largely equal chances, meaning that there's a little bit of uncertainty, and it may be that quick decay in La Nina that's not, maybe why one of the reasons that the forecasters aren't as confident what will happen in the southeast there. That we still do favor above average temperatures though. Next slide. I know that this call was going to focus on winter, but I really think this research on severe weather is interesting, and it's also a question that we get more and more. This is a ENSO blog post we ran a while ago, and it shows the March through May patterns of severe weather with ENSO, and on the top row there is essentially a metric it's an index for environmental conditions that favor tornadoes, and then bottom row is environmental conditions that favor hail. And on the right is the La Niña patterns. On the left is the El Niño patterns. And for now, just focus on the right. The purples there indicate where tornadoes and hail tend to become more frequent. And in the western part of the southeast region, you can see the pattern actually does become more frequent. Over Florida and like the very adjacent Gulf states, the pattern is more normal or even less frequent. Next slide. This is a fairly new paper. It's open access, so you can download it and read it. Sorry for the color change. Here, red shading means a more active severe weather conditions, and the blue shading is less active. And what I like about this is, one, is showing the monthly breakdown, and two, it combines not just La Niña, but also the state of the NAO or Arctic Oscillation. And what's interesting in this work is to show that La Niña plus a positive AO or NAO pattern tends to amplify the chances of a severe weather season. And you can see that extends into the western part of the southeast region, particularly in the months of February and March. In April, the pattern changes somewhat and actually favors below average severe weather, particularly for the Gulf Coast. But if we get La Niña plus a negative AO, that pattern really shifts, becomes much more confined to the Gulf adjacent states there, and is much weaker. So we'll have to keep an eye coming up. I'm very curious whether La Niña combined with the positive AO, NAO coming up in the spring may lead to a more active severe weather station outbreak. All right, next slide. All right, so we're in a La Niña. We expect it to remain there, 76% chance. Transition around neutral around February, March, April. Again, the La Niña pattern, and also I should mention the long-term trends favor warmer and drier winters. And research is starting to indicate that La Niña, and there is still a lot of variability here, plus the positive AO pattern can favor more active severe weather season during the late winter and springs. And that's, you know, in the western part of that southeast region, Alabama, in your domain. Okay, and with that, I'll go ahead and stop, and I guess we'll have some time for questions.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Meredith Muth. I work for NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System, NIDIS. NIDIS co-organizes this webinar series for the last 3 years with the Southeast Regional Climate Center and the National Weather Service. And I just want to extend my gratitude to Michelle for joining us again. She joins us every year. We're so grateful to have her because you are excellent at explaining some pretty complicated phenomena. And I was really pleased to see the inclusion of some cutting edge research that can help with our early warning and predictions of future climate conditions. So thank you again for joining us today, Michelle. Also, many thanks to our usual outstanding speakers, Chris, Pam, and Todd. And what we'll do right now is we'll go into our question and answer period. Please, if you have any questions or comments for our speakers related to anything you heard today or climate in the Southeast, go ahead and put that into the question box. As a reminder, we will be sharing our webinar summaries and a recording, and it'll be easy for you to share with your networks and colleagues as well. We'll have that online at drought.gov. I will also be sure to include links to not only the blogs that Michelle mentioned, but as well as the research article. Just a reminder, we are taking a hiatus in December. There will be no webinar. Happy holidays. And please feel free to join us in January, where we'll have a year in the review, looking back at climate in 2022. It was quite a year. And with that, let's see what we have. We are actually very quiet today. So far, our comments have been wonderful presentation to our presenters, and also another suggestion on what to call a triple dip of La Niña. We have the La Niña hat trick.
I like that. You know, I actually play
like
hockey, so that's perfect.
I think CPC should have had a competition. I'm just going to let this open for a minute to see if any other questions come in from our audience. And while we're waiting, I'd like to open up the floor for any of our speakers, or we have a couple of extra subject matter experts online too, if they would like to add anything else in terms of what they've observed this past month in the Southeast, current conditions, or looking ahead. This has never happened. Michelle, we're just getting thank yous. Thank you.
I'm waiting for someone to ask.
Oh, we have a question.
We had La Nina last winter. How did that forecast do?
Well, I had some questions. It was along that line.
Yeah.
So, go ahead
I
and
can't answer that. If you want me to go ahead and do that.
Yes, please do.
Okay, yeah. So, last winter we had, of course, our double dip La Nina, and we put increased chances for above average temperatures and below average precipitation. And when you go back, and there is an ENSO blog post that did look at the verification. So if you go back through the archive, you can take a very close look at how it did. And bottom line is last winter, those forecasts did pan out over the Southeast broadly, above average temperatures and also below average precipitation. So hopefully we'll see, well, I shouldn't say hopefully, since that could be very devastating for certain interests, but we do expect to see those patterns reemerge this winter.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Here's a question. What is the influence of ENSO on subtropical jet stream?
Yeah, sure. If you can go back to that schematic picture that I had in my talk. So this is very broad brush, but that blue there, you can kind of think of as the average of the jet stream, or it's really where the winds are blowing fastest between the cold water is bottled up near the poles and the warmer tropical temperatures closer to tropics. And bottom line is, so what happens is La Nina suppresses rainfall near the date line. The date line in this image is just south of, it's basically almost, it's near Hawaii there. And so if you can think of the suppressed conditions just south of there, what that does is it creates an environment that's not as friendly toward the jet stream over the North Pacific Ocean. It dries things out in the tropics, and as a result, there isn't as much curl or divergence occurring in that region. And so the jet stream retracts back toward Japan, and you get this big blocking high. So the blocking high essentially diverts the circulation around it and creates that pattern that you see, and this generally poleward shift. If you look at the El Nino patterns, instead there's increased rainfall near the date line and in the tropics, and that creates more favorable circulation for the jet stream to extend out and impinge upon the southern tier of the United States. That becomes much less common in La Nina.
Great, thank you, Michelle. I think that's it. Do any of our speakers have any other last comments before we wrap this up? See, you all did such an outstanding job. There's no questions or comments. Anyways, I just want to thank you all again for joining us. I wish you all a very safe, healthy, wonderful holiday season, and we will see you in January. Take care.
Thank you.